I stood beneath the ballroom chandeliers in a borrowed black vest, balancing a silver tray and my own pulse while Chicago's polished medical elite drifted past me. Gavin had told me the gala would be tedious. All donor speeches and forced smiles. The kind of night that had no place for a wife like me. Then he walked into the hotel ballroom with Sabrina Cole on his arm. And the room did not stiffen in surprise because everyone looked already adjusted to them. He wore the expression I used to know by heart. That warm, open smile that made strangers trust him. And tonight he spent it entirely on her. Sabrina moved beside him in a dark silk dress, one hand resting briefly at her waist, refusing champagne with a soft no. Not tonight. Thank you. I kept my head lowered as he lifted a glass from my tray without seeing me at all. And that was the first moment humiliation became something colder. Two executives near the auction table exchanged the kind of glance wealthy people think is discreet. And one quietly murmured, "So this is the woman tonight." Nobody laughed. Nobody corrected him. And that silence hit harder than the affair, because silence like that only happens when a replacement has been socially approved. I had come there to catch my husband cheating, but standing 3 feet from them, I understood that cheating was only the smallest visible part. Sabrina leaned toward him to say something I could not hear, and Gavin tipped his head down with the easy attention of a man already living elsewhere than mine. My fingers locked around the tray so hard the metal edge bit my palm, and I knew I was not watching a secret unfold anymore. I was watching the moment my marriage had already been rewritten in public, and the worst part was how naturally the room had made space. I stayed on the floor instead of running because panic would have made me blind. And I needed my eyes more than my dignity now. Moving between tables with a water pitcher and practiced silence, I followed the current that kept pulling Gavin and Sabrina toward the people whose approval mattered most. Up close. The affair looked even worse because it had structure, timing, and the smoothness of something rehearsed long before I ever stepped into that room. Near the donor wall, Sabrina paused beside a woman from operations who touched her wrist and murmured, "Next quarter is going to look very different for you." Sabrina's smile barely shifted as she answered, "I think a lot of things are about to open up." And the other woman gave her a knowing nod. I kept pouring water as if I belonged there, but that one exchange landed harder than the hand on his arm because ambition had just introduced itself. I started fitting old details into place with a speed that made me feel sick. The overnight conferences, the revised expense reports, the locked screen whenever I entered. Gavin had not stumbled into an affair and lost his judgment afterward, because men do that messily, and nothing about this looked messy anymore. This looked budgeted, timed, and quietly socialized through the same executive circle that had smiled at me for years, while deciding I no longer belonged inside it. When I passed their table again, Sabrina leaned in and said something low enough to miss. But Gavin answered with a calm little nod that belonged to a man discussing logistics. I did not need the words after that because I had already heard enough, and the proof was standing under crystal light in a dress chosen for conquest. I slipped into the staff restroom, locked the stall, pressed my hand over my mouth, and understood with perfect clarity that if I reacted like a wife, I was finished. By morning, I was in a quiet hotel suite off Michigan Avenue, fully dressed, coffee untouched, watching Gavin return to our condo in the same tuxedo he had worn for her. He moved with the tired confidence of a man who still believed he could step between two lives without either one locking behind him. Then he opened the door, stopped in the entryway, and felt the first real consequence before he ever saw the papers. The condo was not wrecked, which would have given him something theatrical to resent. And it was not sentimental either, which would have invited him to pretend regret. It was simply emptied with precision, my clothes gone, my files gone, the framed photographs from the hallway removed cleanly enough to leave pale rectangles on the wall. He called my name once, then again. But even through silence, I could see him understand that absence has a sound when it is deliberate. On the dining table, I had left exactly 3 things. My wedding ring, a thick legal envelope, and a stack of surveillance photographs arranged with the cold order of medical records. He picked up the ring first and turned it once between his fingers, like a man checking whether a familiar object still recognized him. Then he saw the photos beneath. Him and Sabrina outside conference hotels. Him and Sabrina at late dinners billed as business. Him and Sabrina moving through the city with the ease of repetition. By the time he reached the divorce petition, the blood had already drained from his face because Betrayal looks different when it is cataloged, dated, and professionally printed. The first page from Evelyn Ward's office did what my voice no longer needed to do, placing his name, my name, and the beginning of the end into language he could not charm. He stood there in our spotless kitchen, holding proof with both hands. And for the first time since I had known him, Gavin looked like a man who understood that being underestimated cuts both ways. Gavin did not call me first after reading Evelyn's letter, because men like him only reach for the wife after checking whether the world still answers to them. He called Miles Carter, expecting familiarity, leverage, maybe even masculine sympathy, and instead got a voice as steady as winter glass, telling him the emergency governance meeting had already concluded. I heard every word from the chair beside the window, where I sat with my phone face down and my spine straight, no longer waiting to be included in my own life. Gavin kept pushing, asking what meeting, what authority, what exactly my lawyers thought they were doing. And Miles let the silence sit until it became part of the answer. Then he told him I had attended, that outside counsel had been present, and that his access would remain suspended pending a formal compliance review. Gavin tried to laugh it off, but panic has a thin sound when it hits a man used to being obeyed, and I could hear it under every clipped breath. Miles did not raise his voice when he gave Gavin the part that finally cut through, because truth lands harder when no one has to force it. The early capital that stabilized the clinic network years ago had come through a trust tied to my mother's family, and the controlling position behind that structure had never belonged to Gavin. He had spent 6 years treating me like a careful, useful wife with tasteful habits and no appetite for power, while living comfortably inside a system my family had strengthened long before he entered it. I had never hidden gold bars in the walls or played poor for sport, and that was what made the mistake feel so ordinary and so fatal. Gavin mistook restraint for dependence, my refusal to perform wealth for the absence of it, and my quiet for the kind of softness men can budget around. When Miles finished by telling him governance had finally caught up to reality, I closed my eyes for one clean second and let the truth settle where humiliation had been. By noon, Evelyn had separated the emotional facts from the financial ones, which was exactly what I needed, because grief makes noise and records do not. Russell Pike's file placed Gavin and Sabrina in the same hotels, the same private dining rooms, the same falsely coded conference windows, often enough to turn suspicion into a pattern. Miles did the rest from inside the system, freezing approval authority, preserving internal records, and opening a review narrow enough to stay clean and sharp. What made the affair dangerous was not the sex, not even the public humiliation, but the trail of polished little lies wrapped around it like expensive ribbon. Dinners had been filed as physician outreach, overnight stays as scheduling overflow, travel add-ons as operational necessity, and every line item looked respectable until placed beside photographs. Once those two sets of facts touched each other, the story Gavin had been counting on stopped sounding like a marriage gone bad and started sounding like misuse. He called me 3 times before I answered, and when I finally let his voice in, he came through furious, breathless, already trying to drag me back into the role. He called me vindictive, irrational, obsessed, then warned I was blowing up his career over a personal issue, as if money had not moved and forms had not been signed. I waited until he finished and told him quietly that he was not losing his position because I saw him with Sabrina. He was losing it because he kept spending like no one would ever read closely. That was the point where the old balance finally broke, because Gavin had always relied on confidence to outrun detail. and detail was all I had left him. Evelyn moved the marital side forward under the agreements he had once signed too quickly, while compliance handled the business side without theater. Exactly the way real damage gets counted. By the time he understood that the affair was only the lid and the money underneath was what would really bury him, the circle had already begun to close. Sabrina did not crumble when the review notice circulated. And that was how I knew every soft gesture at the gala had only ever been presentation. When Gavin finally reached her, she did not ask whether I knew, whether I was hurt, or whether any of this could still be contained. She wanted to know which expense codes had been flagged, whether her name appeared on reimbursement trails, and who still had access to archived approvals. I did not need the rest of the call to understand the full shape of her, because innocent women do not begin with exposure logistics. Gavin tried to pull her back into the language of intimacy, lowering his voice, calling her sweetheart, telling her they only needed a few days. Sabrina cut straight through him and asked whether compliance had frozen his authority entirely, because if it had, she needed to protect herself before anyone else decided for her. That was the moment their romance finally looked like what it had always been. A private merger built on appetite, convenience, and the belief that I would stay quiet long enough to make it viable. Gavin still sounded stunned that love was not showing up to save him, but Sabrina had never confused desire with loyalty, and she was not about to start now. When he asked if he could stay with her until things settled, she went flat and told him no. Not here. Not now. Not with my name anywhere near this. I felt no urge to interrupt, no need to correct her, and no interest in claiming moral superiority over a woman who had already chosen her terms. Sabrina was not a victim waking up late to a bad man, because she had helped build the fantasy, walked through it proudly, and planned to profit from its stability. She only recoiled when the floor moved, and by then it was too late for innocence, too late for romance, and far too late for either of them to pretend I had been the only person in that marriage who understood survival. When I returned to the condo that afternoon, Evelyn stood beside me with a folder under one arm, while building security and a uniformed officer kept everything formal. Gavin was already in the doorway, unshaven now, furious in a clean shirt that could not hide the collapse beneath it, staring at me like eye contact could restore power. The marriage was over by then, and what remained on that threshold was paperwork, possession, and a man learning too late that access is not ownership. He stepped forward and demanded that I stop hiding behind lawyers, stop performing calm, stop acting like I had not planned this from the start. I let him spend those seconds because anger was the only asset he still believed grew when displayed, and it was shrinking even while he raised it. Then I told him I had not built a plan to destroy him. I had built one to make sure he could not keep lying from inside my home. That hit harder than shouting would have. But Gavin still reached for the version where cruelty could pass for honesty, if he named it boldly enough. He said the marriage had been dead for months, that Sabrina only arrived after the truth was already obvious, that I was punishing him for leaving first. I answered that men leave all the time without falsifying expenses, repurposing shared assets, and rehearsing a replacement in public. So moral clarity was no longer his language. Evelyn opened the folder and read the occupancy terms with the clipped patience of someone interested only in sequence, authority, and what had already been documented. Gavin looked from her back to me, still searching for the wife who softened, the woman who explained, the person who once confused endurance with love. I gave him none of that, because by then Sabrina had stopped answering. His credentials were gone, and even his keys looked smaller in his hand. Gavin did not disappear after I closed the door on him, because men like him would rather burn a structure down than admit they were never the foundation. By that night, Russell Pike had already sent a short update from downtown, saying Gavin was inside an internet cafe, hunched over a public computer, typing with desperate, punishing speed. I knew that posture before I ever saw the attached image. because it was the same rigid stillness Gavin wore whenever he decided damage was preferable to humiliation. He was searching the business desks, the regulators, every place where a dramatic leak might let him rename himself as conscience instead of consequence. Russell sent one more line, saying Gavin had started drafting emails about offshore arrangements, reimbursement channels, and internal approvals he believed would drag everyone down beside him. But Miles had moved earlier that day, locking preservation orders into place, opening voluntary review, and putting the company on record before Gavin could pretend he was delivering revelation. That changed the meaning of every sentence Gavin typed, because he was no longer exposing hidden wrongdoing from the outside. He was confirming operational knowledge from the inside. His own language tied him tighter, each detail proving not innocence, not distance, but familiarity precise enough to show where he had stood when the system bent. I never went to watch the rest unfold, because by then the final blow no longer belonged to anger, or marriage, or even me, only to a record carrying his words, his timestamps, and his name. Years passed without spectacle, and I knew I had survived because real peace never arrives like victory and never asks for witnesses. I kept my name, my work, and the parts of myself I lost trying to stay understandable to men who preferred convenience. Gavin kept his consequences. Sabrina kept her freedom but not her future. And Patricia carried the grief of loving what she raised. I did not rebuild my life as a monument to betrayal, and that restraint became the cleanest ending I could have chosen. Miles entered slowly, without rescue fantasies or opportunism, bringing steadiness, patience, and a kind of respect that never asked me to shrink. By the time love found me again, it felt nothing like adrenaline and everything like entering a room where I could unclench. Now when evening settles over Chicago, I go home to a life that does not require decoding, bargaining, or performance before rest. I do not measure what I won in titles, houses, or apologies, because the quiet itself became the proof I needed most. The sharpest thing I carried out of that marriage was clarity, and clarity is gentle enough to sound like peace when it finally stays. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and for bringing your time, your heart, and your quiet attention all the way here. If this kind of truth stays with you, stay close. I hope you find peace that feels steady, love that feels safe, and a life that no longer asks you to explain yourself.